This is the story of West Coast Airlines Flight 956. West Coast Airlines, as the name suggests, was an airline that connected smaller cities in the Pacific Northwest to bigger cities in California, Utah, Idaho, Oregon, etc. On the 1st of October 1966, one of West Coast's newest DC-9s was on the ground at San Francisco. Flight 956 would have 3 pilots in the cockpit, 2 very experienced captains, and 1 first officer. Captain Donald Aldridge had more than 18,000 hours of experience. Captain Charles Warren had more than 21,000 hours of experience. And First Officer Pete Labusky had more than 9,500 hours of experience. Their ultimate destination was the city of Seattle in Washington, with intermediate stops in Eugene and Portland. The plane left San Francisco at 6:44 p.m. and arrived at Eugene at 7:34 p.m. Once the plane had taken off from Eugene, Flight 956 was assigned an altitude of 12,000 feet, which was then raised to 14,000 feet. This was a short flight, so they wouldn't be climbing too high. In fact, they didn't spend much time at 14,000 feet, as within minutes they got their descent clearance. They were asked to descend to 9,000 feet, and the captain said, "Roger, descend to 9,000 feet, leaving 14,000. As they descended from 14,000 feet, the crew inquired about the runway in use at Portland. It was runway 28 right. To set them up on the approach to runway 28 right, the controller asked them to turn to 300 degrees. As the DC-9 turned to the right, the controller lost the plane on radar. He asked the crew to let them know when the plane was established on a heading of 300 degrees. He repeated his message, and the pilots responded with, "956, we'll go." In the tower, the controller waited to hear back from Flight 956. He stared at his radar scope, waiting for Flight 956 to reappear, but it didn't. The controller tried to reach the plane via radio, but he got no reply. He tried again, but to no avail. Minutes after last hearing from the plane at 8:15 p.m., the controller initiated the accident notification procedures. A few hours later, they found the wreck of Flight 965 near Mount Hood. None of the 18 people on board survived. Once the site had been located, the investigators retrieved the black boxes. But in a blow to the investigation, only the data recorder worked. The voice recorder was broken beyond repair. Without the voice recorder, they turned to the wreck for clues. The damaged trees indicated that the plane was pitching up when it hit the mountain and banking to the right at 30 degrees. This indicated that the crew might have been trying to avoid the mountain. They also found all 4 corners of the airplane at the crash site. This meant that the DC-9 was more or less intact until it hit the mountain. Analysis of the engines also showed that they were functioning at impact. They couldn't establish the exact power setting, but looking at the bleed valves, they were able to deduce that the engines were at a power setting a lot higher than idle when the plane hit the mountain. As far as they could tell, the DC-9 was in perfect condition. I mean, why wouldn't it be? It had only been inducted the month before. Looking for answers, they listened through the conversation of the pilots and the controller. The controller cleared them down to 9,000 feet, and the pilots clearly acknowledged that. They knew they were cleared to 9,000 feet. They said, "Roger, descend to 9,000, leaving 14,000. But for some reason, the pilots of 956 kept descending all the way down to 4,000 feet. The investigators wondered if the pilots got confused about their assigned altitude because they misinterpreted a transmission meant for another plane. But there were no transmissions like that at the time Flight 956 crashed. What's even more confusing is the fact that the crew seemed to be aware of the tall mountains in the area. For example, when they started their descent, the controller asked them to turn to the right to 300 degrees. The crew double-checked with the controller to make sure that he wanted them to make a right turn, as making a right turn at that point would take them very close to Mount Hood. So the pilots opted for a longer turn to keep a safe distance from the mountain. There are even more clues that suggested that they knew exactly where they were. When they began the right turn around Mount Hood, the DC-9 slowed from 290 to 266 knots. Now, there is a speed limit in the terminal area around Portland. The data looked like they were aware that they were in the terminal area and they were slowing down to conform to its rules. But for some reason, they failed to stay at 9,000 feet as they had been instructed. The other thing to note is that the plane did level off before it hit the mountain. They didn't descend all the way till impact. At 8:08 p.m. and 38 seconds, the plane leveled off. This suggested that the autopilot leveled the plane at 4,000 feet. If that's the case, why did someone select 4,000 feet on the autopilot? When they plotted the path of Flight 956, they noticed that most of the descent was carried out over the Salmon River Valley and the South Fork of the Salmon River. Those are desolate areas with very few visual cues, so it's possible that they never even saw the mountain that was right in front of them until it was too late. What's sad about this is that the DC-9 was not equipped with a radar altimeter, which would have warned these pilots. They were flying blind, literally and figuratively. But they still had no answer as to why the plane descended so low. Maybe the pitot tubes iced up, but they were heated. Then they hypothesized that water might have gotten into the static lines of the altimeter. But they found that West Coast Airlines had installed drains in the lines to let out water. They also concluded that a blocked pitot tube would not cause the crash. They didn't even know who was flying the plane when it crashed. That's how scarce information on this crash was. They think that the captain was in the left seat, the check captain was in the right seat, and the first officer was in the jump seat. That's all that they can tell. The one thing that might explain this crash is the fact that you needed to be at 3,700 feet for the approach to runway 28 right. Maybe they jumped the gun and started descending way too soon. That's the only explanation that makes sense to me. But ultimately, the investigators weren't able to say with certainty why the pilots descended too low. Maybe we'll never know. Since it's been so long, I'm going to throw some theories your way, and you can tell me which one you think is the most likely one. Theory number 1 is that this was a deliberate act, but I have a hard time believing that because of 2 reasons. One is that whoever was in control stabilized the plane. Who does that? Look at other deliberate crashes. No one stabilizes the plane before impact. The other thing is that an attempt was made by whoever was in control of the plane to save it. It doesn't sound like they wanted the plane to crash. The other theory is that they just forgot about the 9,000 feet limit and then proceeded to descend below the minimum safe altitude. But this theory also has a few holes. For one, this was an experienced crew. Flight 956 had 2 captains and a first officer. They had tens of thousands of hours of experience between them. Going below the minimum safe altitude doesn't sound like a mistake that such an experienced crew would make. On top of that, they weren't fatigued. They were well rested and they had only been on the job for about 6.5 hours. And that brings us to theory number 3. The DC-9 was a brand new airplane. This one had just been in service for a month. Could the new systems on the plane have confused the crew, so much so that they didn't realize how low they were? There have been instances of pilots misreading the altimeter. Could this be another instance of that? Unfortunately, we may never know. But which theory is most likely in your opinion? Let me know in the comments below. If you were around in the 1960s, were there any unofficial word-of-mouth theories about what happened to Flight 956? I would love to hear your stories. If you want to watch another unsolved mystery, do consider watching the video on Alaska Airlines Flight 1866. Now, that video was made a long time ago, so the sound might not be up to scratch. Just letting you know, but enjoy. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.